Hi, IB History Year 1 students. Today we're going to really look at two of our learning targets, one of which is to describe how events of spring 1917 through 1918 nearly brought about a German victory in the war. And then number 22, I can evaluate the German decision to violate the Sussex Pledge and resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So for the first one, it's simply a matter of explaining the events that almost brought Germany victory. And for the second one, I want you to be able to judge whether Germany's decision to violate the Sussex Pledge was the right one. And this brings us into the issue of how the United States got into the war. So during World War I, the Germans had really perfected the technology of the submarine, which they called Unterseeboot. And submarines had actually technically been around in warfare dating back to the War of American Independence, when a small, partially submerged vehicle called the Terrible Turtle, piloted by American patriots, sank a British vessel in New York Harbor. But the modern submarine, which employs ballast tanks to either surface or descend below the surface of the water, that really didn't come into existence in warfare until the First World War. And the Germans led the way in the development of this. So if you understand a little bit about how a submarine works, when a World War I submarine is on the surface of the water, it usually operates using a diesel engine, which then exhausts directly into the air. So when it's on the surface, the diesel can simply exhaust to the air, and that's not a problem. But of course, when it wants to submerge, it then has to run on battery power. So when the submarine is at the surface, it's running its diesel engine not just to propel the propeller and drive the submarine through the water, but also to charge up the battery. When the submarine wants to submerge, then the diesel engine shuts down and the submarine kicks over to battery power, which then, of course, can only run for a certain amount of time. So World War I era submarines could not remain submerged indefinitely. They had to return to the surface to charge their battery. It was effectively a hybrid. Diesel running on its diesel engine at times, charging the battery with the diesel, and running on the battery when submerged. When the submarine wanted to descend below the surface of the water, it had these ballast tanks, and you would open up the sort of valves that would allow water to fill the ballast tanks, and the submarine would dive. And then when you wanted to surface again, you'd blow the water out of those ballast tanks, which would then cause the submarine to come back to the surface. The submarine really had two means of attacking other ships. One was a deck gun, which you actually see mounted on this submarine, this German Unterseeboot right here. That functioned like any other naval gun. You'd blast away at an enemy ship with it. Or a submarine had what were called torpedoes, which were like missiles that fly through the water. It could launch torpedoes. It could not use its deck gun, obviously, when submerged. It had to attack using torpedoes when submerged. And so a submarine captain during the war, whenever possible, would surface and use a deck gun to attack enemy shipping. Because if you could do that, then you could not run down your battery. In fact, you could charge your battery while you were doing it, while you were hunting and destroying the enemy ship. So if a German submarine captain was looking through his periscope and he saw a British cargo ship traveling across the ocean all by itself, he would surface and blast away at it with his deck gun. On the other hand, if he looked through his periscope and he saw that the targets that he wanted to hit was being escorted by warships, then he would remain submerged and launch torpedoes, or give up on the target for the moment completely, and maybe shadow it until perhaps it was safer to come to the surface. There was only a limited number of torpedoes, so you used them sparingly. But on the other hand, you couldn't surface in the presence of an enemy warship. Submarines were not heavily armed like most warships are. They couldn't afford that. You couldn't have thick, heavy plates of armor. It would make it almost impossible for the ship to dive and surface. So submarines relied on being underwater as their main source of protection. But as a consequence, if they did take a hit, they would sink very easily because they didn't have heavy armor to protect them. So for that reason, German submarine captains were never going to surface if they could avoid it in the presence of enemy warships. They would have to attack using torpedoes. Again, on the other hand, though, if here's a cargo ship without any protection, yeah, you're going to surface and blast away with your deck gun. So that's sort of a very, very basic primer on submarines and submarine tactics during the First World War. Now, what the German submarines were targeting were British and French merchant ships or cargo ships who were transporting war materials manufactured in the United States across the Atlantic Ocean to support their war efforts. The United States, remember, was neutral. Starting with the beginning of the war and continuing through April 1917, the United States had been declared neutral by President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson believed that that war would be disruptive to American society and to the American economy. Very quickly, he recognized exactly what this war was and what the nature of this war was and how catastrophic it was going to be for the soldiers involved and for their families. And so he had declared the United States neutral. Now, what that meant was that American manufacturers, and keep in mind, by this time, the United States had far surpassed the United Kingdom as the largest manufacturer in the world, but it meant that American manufacturers were free to manufacture and sell war materials to whomever they wanted. So theoretically, for example, they could sell them to the Germans or the other Central Powers. Because the United States ended up on the side of the Allied powers in the war, there's this sort of assumption that from the very beginning we were hostile to the Central Powers despite declaring neutrality and that we would not sell things to them. That's not true. American manufacturers were free and willing, perfectly willing to profit by selling war materials to both sides. However, the British naval blockade made that effectively impossible because German merchant ships could not leave or enter German ports, nor could the merchant ships of any of the other Allied powers. There was one German cargo submarine, an unarmed German cargo submarine that managed to make it across the Atlantic and arrived in Virginia and loaded up on American-built war materials and then left for Germany, but it never reappeared. So no one knows whether it made it to Germany or whether it didn't make it, whether it sank due to some sort of disaster, whether it was destroyed by Allied shipping, but it never reappeared. So in general, despite that one unique counterexample, the Germans, because of the British naval blockade, the Central Powers, because of the British naval blockade, could not purchase war materials from the United States. So effectively, it was only the Allied powers who benefited from the opportunity to purchase and transport war materials produced by American manufacturers. So the German submarines were out in the Atlantic looking to destroy British and French or other Allied merchant ships carrying war materials purchased in the United States to support their war efforts. The United States didn't care. I mean, there was no neither the United States government nor American manufacturers suffered any loss when Allied cargo ships were sunk by German submarines. By that time, the war materials that the ships were carrying had been paid for. They were no longer the property of Americans. And so it was the British and French who were taking the loss on that. So there was no particular hostility of the U.S. government toward the German use of submarines early in the war. However, in the spring of 1915, a German submarine sank a passenger ship, which was called the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was part of the Cunard cruise lines, which is a British cruise line. So again, not an American ship. And there were a fairly minimum number of Americans on board. But the sinking of the Lusitania alarmed Americans and sort of outraged Americans because this was not a cargo ship. It was a passenger vessel. And as such, 1,260 civilians died when it sank. As you can see in the newspaper headline from the New York Times here, it sinks in 15 minutes. Um, this this was not an example of negligence on the part of the cruise line, the way, for example, that the loss of life on the Titanic had been. The Titanic had sunk, after striking an iceberg in 1912, which was 3 years prior to this. Remember, there were not enough lifeboats on board the Titanic, which is why so many people died. There were plenty of lifeboats on board the Lusitania. The reason why so many people died here is that it sank so quickly. And as you can see, the initial report here was that it was torpedoed twice. Now, it turns out that's not the case. Only one torpedo struck the Lusitania. There was, however, a secondary explosion on board the Lusitania caused by a cargo of munitions. That is, like gunpowder and artillery shells that was being carried in the Lusitania's cargo hold. You say, well, what's going on here? Well, often these cruise ships these passenger liners had huge space for cargo underneath. In the part of the ship that was not suitable for people, they had large amounts of cargo space. And oftentimes the luggage of the passengers, I would imagine particularly during wartime, it didn't take up all that cargo space. So the lines would sell that additional space to anybody who needed to transport materials across the ocean, including just cargo, that would usually be loaded on board a cargo ship. The lines would sell that space. Well, they had sold space for a company that had manufactured munitions that had been purchased by the British. And so when the torpedo struck the Lusitania, the torpedo exploded, but then those munitions exploded as well. And so the torpedo kind of ripped the Lusitania apart from the inside, which helps to explain, or rather the two explosions did that, which sort of helps to explain why it sank so fast. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Germans had targeted the Lusitania quite intentionally because of this. The Germans had an extensive spy network here in the United States, and they knew what was on board the Lusitania. The German consulate in New York, which is sort of like an embassy, had actually taken out an advertisement in New York newspapers warning Americans not to board the Lusitania, that it was a ship subject to being torpedoed. As a result, there were a relatively small number of Americans on board when it sank. So the number of Americans killed when the Lusitania sank was fairly low, maybe about 10% of those killed, maybe 120 to 130. But nevertheless, it stoked American outrage, not just the fact that some Americans had been killed, but that the Germans had now targeted a passenger ship. This was considered to be a bridge too far in times of war, that you were taking war right at civilians. And so there was a bit of a frenzy in the United States that turned public opinion against the Germans. Originally, it wasn't that way. At the start of the war, public opinion was pretty evenly split. Public opinion was as neutral as our policy in some ways because of the British naval blockade. The British naval blockade meant that American merchants could not trade with the Central Powers, and therefore that American manufacturers could not sell their products to the Central Powers. And that was considered a violation of America's neutral trading rights. It was a violation of America's neutral trading rights by the British, and this wasn't the first time they'd done that. We went to war with the British in 1812 over this. And so there was the British suffered in American public opinion. And remember, there was a large number of Americans who traced their ancestry to Germany. And so part of the neutrality of the United States was in public opinion. There was ambivalent public opinion toward the war. And there were those who saw the British as big a problem, if not more, than the Germans. But this tended to change things. The sinking of the Lusitania caused there to be a sharp turn in American public opinion against Germany. And there was even talk of war. But the president didn't want the United States to go to war. I mean, again, by this time it was very clear what this war was going to be like. And so the president hoped to negotiate the United States' way out of this, arguing sometimes a nation must be too proud to fight. However, when a German submarine attacked another passenger ship, this time a British passenger ferry called the Sussex, which was an English Channel ferry. This one, as you can see, actually made it across to port despite its bow being blown off. Now the president felt the need to turn up the pressure on the Germans. And however, he was still trying to avoid U.S. entry into the war. And he succeeded in negotiating with the Germans something called the Sussex Pledge. And it was named after the Sussex being the second passenger ship that the Germans had attacked. It could perhaps have been called the Lusitania Pledge, but it was called the Sussex Pledge. And the promise that the Germans made in order to avoid war with the United States was that German submarines would attack no neutral ship. The Germans promised that German submarines would attack no neutral ship. The United States being a neutral country, that would protect our ships. Now, keep in mind, though, that would not have protected the people on board the Lusitania, which was a British ship. So additionally, there was a second promise that was part of the Sussex Pledge, in which the Germans promised they would attack no ship without first surfacing. The submarine that was going to attack would first surface and give warning, so that the crew and or passengers could abandon ship before the ship was destroyed. You say, well, that's crazy. Why would a submarine surface? The whole point of a submarine is to remain underwater. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, the Germans weren't after the crew. They weren't after the passengers. They wanted to destroy the cargo. They wanted to make sure the cargo never made it to Britain or France. And they wanted to destroy the ship as well. And so at the time that the German government agreed to this pledge, it didn't seem like such a bad pledge. After all, German submarines regularly surfaced to attack ships, and a German submarine that was looking to attack a ship that was guarded by warships oftentimes would back off anyway. So it seemed to the Germans to be a good deal to keep the United States out of the war. They promised in the Sussex Pledge to attack no neutral ships, and before attacking any ship, to surface and give warning so that the crew and passengers could abandon ship. However, the Germans almost immediately repented of this, didn't realize that this was a bad deal for a couple of reasons. Number one, the British and French governments, realizing that they were better off transporting their purchased American war materials on neutral ships, now began to hire merchant ships from neutral countries to transport their manufactured goods. They began to hire, for example, American merchant ships to carry their neutral goods, so that would protect their manufactured goods as they were coming across the ocean. As for British and French cargo ships, they now mounted deck guns on board their cargo ships, and they would keep it covered up with a tarp. And when a German submarine would surface to give warning, the crew would go out, uncover the deck gun, and start blasting away at the submarine. And again, if the submarine took just one hit from that deck gun, it would sink and the crew would be killed. So very, very quickly, the German military command told the leaders of the civilian government, what was left of it, that this is a bad deal. The Sussex Pledge is a bad deal. That in reality, it was as if they had no submarines at all. They had so severely restricted the operation of their submarines that now American manufactured goods were flowing sort of completely unhindered across the Atlantic Ocean, and that they were effectively a lifeline for the Allied war effort. This was at a time when Germany was sensing victory. Keep in mind that by the spring of 1917, you had Russia on the brink of collapse. The Germans had by now committed to join Austria-Hungary in fighting the Italians on the southern front. And the Germans were beginning to sense that victory was still possible, despite the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, despite the British blockade, naval blockade, despite the fact that this war had dragged on much longer than they thought. Victory might still be possible, but not if the Western allies, Britain and France, could continue to rely on this continuous flow of war materials produced in the United States. The German command told the government, we can sink if our submarines are cut loose and allowed to operate in the Atlantic in an unrestricted way, break the Sussex Pledge, and allow our submarines to attack any ship from any country, anytime, without warning. They predicted that they could destroy 600,000 tons of Allied ships and cargo per month. And they said that will strangle the British and French. That will make it almost impossible for them to carry out the war. And so the government said, well, but won't that bring the United States into the war? And the answer from the German commanders was yes, but the United States maintains a very small army, which was true. We maintained a large navy, but a relatively small army when times when we were not at war. We had oceans separating us from our most dangerous rivals. And so we maintained a strong navy, but the U.S. Army at that time numbered only 200,000 men. The rest of the world had been at war for 3 years, but the United States Army numbered only 200,000 men. And to put that in perspective of this war, remember that the Battle of the Somme had produced 1 million casualties. The Battle of Verdun had produced 800,000 casualties. Remember that France, in the 5 months of fighting of 1914 alone, had lost 249,000 men killed, but the U.S. Army numbered only 200,000 men. So the German commanders sort of correctly said, look, it'll take the United States quite some time to recruit an army large enough to make a difference in this war. They're going to have to recruit it, they're going to have to train it, and then they're going to have to send it across the Atlantic Ocean with our submarines attacking their troop ships in order to deploy that army. And so the German commander said it'll take at least a year. It'll take at least a year before large numbers of American troops are available to fight on the Western Front. And by that time, our stranglehold on the Atlantic will have caused the British and French war efforts to collapse, and we will have won the war. By the time the Americans are ready to fight, the war will be over. Now, I know what you're thinking. Here we go again. The German command is always building these great plans that always rely on timing, that everything is around assumptions about timing, and just like the Schlieffen Plan was. So this is starting to sound a little ridiculous in some ways. But for what it's worth, they were right about us and how long it would take us to recruit and train and deploy an army. As a matter of fact, it took more than a year. It took us 14 months. When the United States finally declared war in April of 1917, it was not until June of 1918 that large numbers of American troops were ultimately fighting on the battlefields of France. So the German command convinced their government, and in the fall of 1916, or winter of 1916, clicking over to winter of 1917, the Germans resumed what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. Unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning the Sussex Pledge was out, and the Germans began to sink ships of any country they wanted, anytime they wanted, without warning. And that now included American merchant ships. Well, the violation of the Sussex Pledge and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare is ultimately what did, in fact, cause the United States to enter the war. In April of 1917, now calling Germany a madman to be curbed and declaring the world must be made safe for democracy, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of the U.S. Congress seeking a declaration of war. Remember that under the Constitution, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but only Congress can declare war. The president requests a declaration of war and usually makes a speech laying out the case for war, and then Congress votes on it. It's interesting to note that Congress debated the declaration of war for 4 days in April of 1917 before finally overwhelmingly voting, but nevertheless, after debate, voting in favor of a declaration of war. And so the United States was in the war starting in April 1917, but not really fighting the war. Our army was not yet prepared to fight and would not be prepared for about 14 months. Now, during that 14 months, the Germans very nearly won the war. A couple of things happened. Number one, you remember that in October of 1917, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians went on the attack along the Isonzo front in northeastern Italy and decisively defeated the Italians at the Battle of Caporetto, also known as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo. They decisively defeated the Italians and crippled the Italians to the point where the Italian army was forced to play defense for the remainder of the war. That effectively brought the war on the southern front to an end, at least as far as the Germans were concerned. They could now hand the war effort back over to Italy, or back over to Austria-Hungary, and expect that Austria-Hungary could effectively sort of finish off the Italians. On the Eastern Front, the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia in October of 1917, November, resulting in the fall of the provisional government. And with the ascension of the Bolsheviks to power then came the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which officially ended the war on the Eastern Front with a German victory. So what that meant is that now, really for the first time in the war, the Germans could do what the Schlieffen Plan had called for them to do at the very beginning, which was direct their entire war effort, really, to the Western Front and the defeat of the Western Allies. Remember that in the Schlieffen Plan, 7/8 of the German army was supposed to be focused on the Western Front at the very beginning of the war to provide this sort of overwhelming force that would crush the Allied armies and then free up German troops to head east to fight the Russians. Of course, that hadn't worked out. The Russians had attacked earlier than expected, and so from the very beginning, troops were being shifted out to the Eastern Front, and Germany was basically in a position where they had to fight a two-front war from the very beginning. Now, with victory achieved effectively on the Southern Front and officially on the Eastern Front, the Germans could do what they were supposed to do, according to the Schlieffen Plan at the very beginning, which is focus their entire war effort on achieving victory on the Western Front. So now, resources from both of the other fronts were now shifted over to the West. And the expectation was then that in the spring of 1918, Germany would achieve a fairly significant advantage over the Allies in terms of manpower on the Western Front. And this was correct. As a matter of fact, once all of the German forces that were freed up from the Southern and Eastern fronts were redirected to the Western Front, the Germans enjoyed a manpower advantage somewhere between 10 and 15% over the British and French and Belgians. Now that doesn't seem like a huge advantage, but remember that by now both armies were just about exhausted. They had been fighting now for almost 4 years, living in the trenches, fighting in the trenches. It was a physically and mentally exhausting experience for all armies involved. And because of that, really any kind of advantage that one side could gain had the potential of being a decisive one. And the Germans had also been experimenting with some new tactics. As we saw in the 12th Battle of the Isonzo or the Battle of Caporetto, the use of stormtroopers to sort of lead the way across no man's land and to gain positions, partial positions, from which they could provide counterfire and to use artillery fire even while the stormtroopers were advancing to kind of help pin down the enemy in their trenches. So the Germans were experimenting with some new tactics. And now they had this advantage. And so the expectation for the Germans was to launch a major offensive in the spring of 1918 with the hope of breaking the Allied lines, breaking the stalemate, driving on Paris, and forcing an end to the war, really before the Americans could arrive in sufficient numbers to make a difference. This has many names, this offensive. It's oftentimes simply referred to as the Spring 1918 Offensive. It is sometimes called the Michael Offensive, and in Germany, Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle. But in April of 1918, German forces began going over the top in an effort to try to break the Allied lines, break the stalemate, and drive on Paris. And as a matter of fact, they had quite a bit of success. Allied troops were exhausted. And as a matter of fact, by that time, the use of unrestricted submarine warfare was beginning to make a difference. As a matter of fact, by that time, about 25% of the British merchant fleet had been sunk by German submarines. And it was beginning to show a little bit in the form of more limited supplies making it through to the British and French. The British and French were still well fed and well supplied in terms of daily necessities, but you're beginning to see a little bit of a shortage in things like artillery shells and stuff like that. But the shock of the German attack had its effect. And in several places, the Germans were able to punch through and drive the British and French backward. And really, the only thing that slowed down the German advance was that by then, the German army was not well supplied at all. They weren't even supplied with sufficient food. And so when German soldiers entered into Allied trenches, when they were able to drive Allied soldiers out of their trenches and found their way into these trenches and saw that Allied soldiers were still really well supplied. In many cases, the Allied soldiers who retreated had left behind them things like food. They didn't have time. They were in retreat. And so they left behind a lot of that. And so German soldiers found in Allied trenches leftovers of food, beer, wine, cigarettes. And the Germans oftentimes stopped to stuff their pockets or even get a bite to eat. And it also, ironically, had almost a bit of a demoralizing impact. So that even though they were on the attack and having success, many German soldiers found themselves somewhat demoralized to see how well supplied the Allied armies were compared to them, because they were, in some cases, almost starving in the trenches. And so it was strange. The German advance was a successful advance. The German offensive was a successful one, driving Allied forces out of their trenches and driving them back toward Paris. And yet it wasn't able to achieve the full victory that the Germans envisioned, because in so many places their troops did not pursue Allied troops to the max, but instead stopped to eat. And it had, in a weird, bizarre way, this sort of unexpected demoralizing impact on some German soldiers. And so the victories that the Germans achieved in the spring, they struggled to capitalize on. But they did by, even with these slowdowns, they did continue to attack. And by June of 1918, they had driven the Allied soldiers 40 miles backward from their original positions. And you've got to remember that in 5 months of fighting at the Battle of the Somme, back in 1916, the Allies had only driven the Germans back about 7 miles in 5 months of fighting. But by June of 1918, after just 2 months, the Germans had driven the Allies back 40 miles. And the Germans were now within 50 miles of the city of Paris. This was as close as the Germans had penetrated to the city of Paris since the very beginning of the war, the Battle of the Marne. And as a matter of fact, the Germans were now in a position to start bombarding Paris with their big heavy artillery, their big rail-mounted guns, killing 250 Parisians. So it really was a dangerous position that the Allies were in. By June of 1918, when the first American soldiers really began to arrive in large numbers, the Allies were in a precarious position. The only thing that had prevented them from being really overwhelmed and defeated on the Western Front had been these occasional slowdowns of the German troops as they advanced. And so the arrival of the Americans was extremely important because it helped provide a stop to that seemingly relentless German advance that had penetrated so close to the city of Paris. So to finish this part, to finish this section, the end of the war, the defeat of the Central Powers, we're going to switch back over to readings and seminars. So this will be our last lecture about the actual combat, the actual conduct of the war. In our next lectures, we'll be talking about the armistice, the impact of the war, and then the peace treaties that officially brought it to an end and the responses to those peace treaties. But for now, we're going to pivot back to readings and seminars. So I'll look forward to teaching those lessons when they come around. And until then, I hope you IB history students can stay healthy and safe. You take good care of yourselves. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.